Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim, and today I want to talk about UX design. Specifically, I want to answer a question from Anubis1101 or Anubis13. I see what you did there. Who asks, is UX design taken seriously in your opinion, or is it more of an afterthought? Are there any specific experiences related to it that you can share that you haven't already? It's a good question, and this does go into a big chunk of my history in video games because over the last 40 some years, massive changes have happened in what you would call UX. UX is a relatively recent term, too. Before that, it was called UI. Before that, it wasn't called anything. So let me talk about kind of how this evolved. When I first started in the game industry in the 80s, there was no UI, there was no UX. It was just you made a game, and part of making a game was there was an input layer and interfaces, and you made those. These were made just like anything else in the game was made. Back then, everybody was a generalist, so anybody might have done these. It might have been several different programmers on the team did it. Often, you're the only programmer on the team, so you did it. It didn't mean that you were a user interface programmer. You were just a programmer, and the interface was part of the game. Then it kind of changed into UI in the 90s. It was considered to be the interfaces, nothing else. And I'll talk in a minute about what I think UX people refer to when they mean UX. It was specifically these are these screens that the player uses when they interact with the game, whether it's a hotbar at the bottom, whether it's an inventory screen that pops up. That was UI. There were still no specific UI people. When I did Rags to Riches, the UI was made by the producer. And he wrote them, and I wish I could find it. He would draw them for me on napkins at lunch or write them on. He had these pads of paper on his desk that realtors would leave. If you lived in Irvine, realtors would always throw paper on your pads of paper on your front porch so that if you own the house and if you ever wanted to sell it, there was the name and picture of a realtor. And the pictures are always like these. Anyway, I had tons of these, and I swore I had them, and I looked for them, and I cannot find it. But that's how interface was kind of treated. It was kind of like, oh yeah, we guess we do have you getting phone calls in the game from people. I guess you're gonna have to make an interface. Here, let's have a portrait, and here's where the text goes, and then there's a done button when they're done reading. Where should it appear on the screen? Just put it in the center. There was no real thought to, hey, what is this going to feel like when the player does it? It's more of a functional approach. A lot of the interfaces were done with whoever was responsible. So, like if there was an inventory interface, the programmer who was going to program it may sit down with the designer who designed it and they talk about it for a while. At some point, they grab an artist and go, "Hey, this is what we're thinking about doing. What's this gonna amount to?" If they were really good, they would get a producer too and go, "Hey, we just planned this and we think it's gonna take 2 months and here's why." Now all this stuff is they get the estimates up front, but back then it was like kind of go as you do it as you go. About late 2000s, I want to say around 2007 or 8. That's when I really started hearing people use the term UX and when we started making a dedicated UX team. When I when I became the design director at Carbine, I wanted a dedicated UX team, and that meant a programmer, an artist, and a designer sitting together in the same room doing just that. And this caused a couple issues. Keep in mind, right then, I kind of wanted specialists. In that sense, I contributed to 3 people specializing in their career, but it was because we really had a lot of interfaces and inputs and screen real estate that needed to be thought of in advance because you had to think what's going to happen when the player's soloing, what is it like when he's in a group, is there enough screen real estate for all of this, what's it like in a raid. So that group generated a lot of questions back to the design group, and stuff had to be redone. There was also a bit of pushback because at Carbine, everybody sat with their own kind. Designers sat with designers, programmers sat with programmers, and artists sat in their own walled off area. This was the one concession I got a room with a designer, a programmer, and an artist. They originally didn't want to do it. That all changed after they just worked a while together because they found they could iterate really quickly. The designer could just turn and ask the programmer, would this be hard to do? I'm thinking about doing this. And the programmer would go, well, if you just change this one little thing here, it would be way easier to code. Oh, I can do that. Boom. Things got a lot more smoothly because the artist sitting right there, he turned around and go, wait, you need an animated icon there, or you need, is the icon going to be 2D or 3D? Is it going to be a texture on a 3D object, or is it going to be an actual, the interface itself is made up of 3D objects? It was interesting to go in there and watch them talk because it was much more interactive and dynamic than I expected. And it worked great, by the way. So UX itself, which we probably should talk about, is more than just interface. It used to be you thought of things as here's the input layer, inputs come in. Is it an event like they've typed A, or is it an event like A is being pressed down, now A is being released? Because sometimes you need to know, is a key being pressed, held, or released? Is it being double tapped? Sometimes you just want to know they type the letter A because you're just doing input into a text box. The UX team thought about these things and took them into account. But it was more than just that input, and it was more than just interfaces. It was sound effects. It was how long things stayed up. It was the coloring of things, which was very important to me. It was the experience, and that's the X in experience. It was, do these interface elements make sense? Are they easy to use? And are they easy for the player to recognize and remember? And that's a tough thing to do. Just saying, does it make sense, is a difficult thing to measure. It's also very difficult for the team to have insight into this. When you've read the design doc and you know what you're trying to do in an interface, that puts you in a very different position than somebody who sits down, has never played the game before, and an interface pops up and they have to figure out what to do. You might think something simple to understand because you made it. You also may think something is really easy to understand or to remember what it means because you've already done it like 100 times. But you've all had the experience in a game where it tells you something like, this is how you do a power attack, double tap this, or hold down the left and right bumpers at the same time, or sweep the mouse back and forth, or double click. But then when you 10, 15 minutes later, when you're actually in the game and you're in the middle of combat, you kind of forget what you were supposed to do. And that's why a lot of interfaces now either have a tutorial level, or the first few times the button pops up, like when you're ready to do a power attack on somebody, a little button may pop up and it's like, press A to do your power attack. These are things that come up when you realize the interface that you designed isn't always super obvious to the player who's playing, and you want to give them clues. You want to lead them at the beginning of the game, and then you can gradually turn that off. I had a video on focus groups. Said I had a love-hate relationship with focus groups. Focus groups for testing UX is one of the things I like, because you will sit down with people who, while they're gamers, and you can usually ask, when you try to collect these people, you want people who are experienced gamers. They're experienced gamers. Sometimes they even say they're experienced in the genre. People go, I play RPGs all the time. And you know that. So then when you watch how they play, you can go, well, we made this interface. In general, gamers aren't getting it. The RPG gamers are. And then you have to ask yourself, well, am I trying to make a game for everybody, or am I trying to make a game for hardcore RPG players? And that will inform how you look at the feedback from the focus group. But I do think focus groups are really good for user interface, because if there's one thing in your game that's supposed to be easy, it should never get in your way, and that's interface. And that's always the thing I tell UX teams. It's a sad truth, but if you design a really good UX for a game, no one will say anything. And yes, I'm generalizing for all the literalists who've been telling me, you're overgeneralizing. in general, people don't say that had a really good interface. If you have to make a good interface, no one will mention it. Make a bad interface, it's at the top of every reviewer's list. So it's kind of the sad part of being a UX designer or programmer or artist is when you do your job, you're kind of not in their way of experiencing the game, and they experience the game and they have a fun time, and their comments are about the game, like, oh, I didn't really like combat, or crafting didn't generate anything I wanted, and or whatever their comments are, pro and con about the game. But if your interface is good, they probably won't mention it. But when it's bad, they can be like, oh, I go in the crafting interface and it never highlights the resources I need for the item I want to make, and it when I'm out in the world collecting things, it doesn't highlight the things that I'm looking for. And there's all kinds of things that they will say if they don't like your interface. But if they love it, silence. So it's a very demanding job with very few vocal rewards. You will rarely hear that, hey, you did a really good job with this, and you will frequently heard, this isn't good, or people don't understand this. It's kind of why I kind of went out of my way on Outer Worlds to stop by the UX people a lot and tell them what I thought about what they were doing, the good stuff and the bad stuff, because I don't think they get that very much. And certainly when the game ships, they usually don't hear anything because they've done a good job. So anyway, that's my thoughts on UX in video games. And I hope this answers your question, Anubis1101.